Last thing I'd add here, and David hit on this, is how thoroughly imminent this policy goal is. Some people approach defunding the police as if it's a radical step when the city of Minneapolis has already taken that step. The Breathe Act that was introduced in Congress yesterday by Representatives Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts and Rashida Tlaib from Michigan effectuates this aim. And if the federal voices of Boston and Detroit and the city of Minneapolis can get behind this initiative to defund police and envision a better, more humane, more secure future, our cities can as well too.
Great. And then maybe moving in a little bit to the federal level, we've heard everything from administrators from the administration, which is playing out, propaganda and misinformation regarding what defunding the police means. We've heard apathy from some leaders, and we've had others who are trying and are just simply not getting the job done. But perhaps we can move a little bit into what it looks like on a federal level and what the current federal budget breakdown is. And how we would shape that if both of you were in office.
I'm happy just to take the first step there. When we look at defunding the police, we could start with the recently passed George Floyd Justice and Policing Act as a starting point for the discussion, because defunding the police is precisely what that act does not do. That act inflates police budgets, particularly in the service of a corporate bait and switch to adopt tools like police body cameras that put more people in prison and expand mass surveillance rather than deal with the underlying accountability problems that are driving us all into the street. Now, there are components of the bill that recently passed through the House with the support of establishment Democrats that are useful, like the proposal to create a registry of violent police, the proposal to for instance, end qualified immunity. These are proposals that many of us, I announced those proposals years ago, and the Movement for Black Lives, frankly, requested them in 2014. So we're talking about corporate Democrats showing up nearly a decade late for reforms that our communities that David and I have been clamoring for years. And I'm grateful to the Democratic leadership for finally pulling its head out of the sand. That's worth praising, I suppose, even while, again, noting the Justice and Policing Act does not defund the police. It does not do what we have been invited to by our community members, and what we are running to do in Congress is to channel and divert resources, billions of dollars, from particularly paramilitary training programs, from programs that facilitate, like the Department of Defense's 1033 program, that transfer the equipment from military and DHS agencies into local police departments. That includes equipment like mine-resistant armor-plated vehicles. It includes equipment like rocket launchers, Stingray surveillance devices, audio cannons to suppress dissent. There are any number of military tools, tear gas, that find their way into local police departments. And it was bad enough when our military industrial complex was relentlessly trained on suppressing democracy abroad. In its search for new markets, its relentless search for new markets, the imperial military industrial complex has turned its fangs on we the people of the United States and our democracy. Again, its architect warned us this would happen. We should not be surprised by it. It was predicted 65 years ago on national television by the President of the United States. And 2 generations of policymakers dug their heads into the sand and did absolutely nothing to defend the Constitution. I dare say most of them don't even understand it well enough to understand how it's implicated here. Last thing I'll just say here, as we look at the federal level, there are the resources and there's also the powers. We have to restrain police powers at the federal level. Ending qualified immunity is part of that. That you could think of that as also guarding and reviving, recommitting to the presumption of innocence and due process. When we allow qualified immunity, what we are functionally saying is that the presumption of innocence is not as important as giving police officers the free rein to kill with impunity. And no one will say that, right? That's not a formal commitment in the law, but it's a functional commitment in the law. And one of the analytical methods I'm committed to is legal realism. And it sometimes takes a legal realist to say what no judge will make explicit. And that is simply this: for the last 60 years, because of judge-created doctrines deferential to police departments, we have suspended the presumption of innocence in the United States and given law enforcement agencies and agents carte blanche legal authority tacitly to kill at will. And that is flatly inconsistent with our constitutional commitments. It cannot go on. And it's survived only this long due to the complicity of corporate Democrats. And if the courts haven't shown up to defend constitutional rights in this arena, Congress has a role to play here too. It's been asleep at the switch for too long. I'm eager to get Congress to show up for civil rights once again. David?
Yes, in regards to everything that what just Shahid just shared on the qualified immunity part, it's something that's very serious that that we need to end right now, because no person, even those who are hired to go ahead and enforce that the law is being followed, should be above the law. We shouldn't have taxpayer money funding these police brutality lawsuits. They should be going out of their pensions. There's so many areas of reform that we need to be doing on a federal level as well. But to go ahead and pass an act, to go ahead and suggest an act like George Floyd Act, and to say that you're done and your service to the people is done and you've done enough, it doesn't make sense, especially when it is all their lip service and they are being complicit with anything and everything that's being passed in Congress right now. And we have complete examples, whether that be continuing to vote and support in increasing the military budget. For the military budget, that's increased 9% each year ever since the years of 2000 to 2009. We have the Department of Defense having $20 trillion plus accounted as accounting error when they are actually supposed to be turning in their budgets every year and responsibly using it. And in fact, when they turn in their budgets requesting for money, they submit financial reports from the previous year showing numbers that are fabricated. And these numbers are fabricated to not show the money that was unspent. And they go ahead and shift the money towards other parts of the department. And these are the things that our representatives must hold the government accountable for in those respects. And to think that that money, we could be spending it towards food, towards housing, towards healthcare for all of our people. Why do we need to spend $150 million on a B-21 bomber that is capable of wiping out a country? Why do we need to order 100 of those? It doesn't make sense. Why do we have representatives who are taking cash loads of money from police unions and then saying that they're protesting for Black lives because they matter? My opponent takes $70,000+ from police unions, and I wouldn't be surprised if Nancy Pelosi did as well. And these are the things that we as the people must wake up and realize, holy shit, like everything is lip service, like every single thing. And this is the time where we need to realize and step up and accept the truth that, yo, I matter, my family matters, my brothers and sisters matter, my community matters. Now's the time for us to step up and say no. So what does that look like? How can we go ahead and better allocate the federal budget to where the people are being served? And just from an example standpoint, for Los Angeles, our numbers came out where 2 weeks ago, now our numbers are, we have over 46,000 people living unhoused in our city alone. To go ahead, what are the costs in housing all of our unhoused brothers and sisters here? It takes $640 million. That's 20% of the LAPD budget. We can end homelessness in Los Angeles if our leaders actually prioritize that. And so if that's what we can do on a local level, imagine what we can do on a federal level. And these are very serious things that we need to continue to talk about and host town halls about and really mobilize with those around us.
I want to just add two things here. I'm so grateful for you to connect the defund police to defund the Pentagon, because there's a micro and a macro, global and local connection here. Because the very same industrial corruption that leads us to hurl money down the trough of domestic law enforcement and degrade the rights of our communities is very analogous to the longer standing, equally long standing project of international imperialism that we've been engaged in. And I want to make this point clear. When we talk about defunding the Pentagon, there too, we are talking about better addressing real national security needs. We have real national security needs in the United States. They include, for instance, addressing a global pandemic. They include a mounting global climate catastrophe in which we are thoroughly complicit. They include the need to make sure that an election happens in November in spite of the machinations of an aspiring tyrant. You can't fight any of those things with a bomber. You can't fight any of those things with a next generation strike fighter. that doesn't fly and has been built before the specifications were even finished, derided as an object of industrial abuse, even by its procurers. I'm talking here about the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which will cost $2.5 trillion by the time we are done, for a weapons platform that can't possibly meet our security needs, even if it worked, which it does not. What are we, and then people tell us we don't have the money for healthcare and doctors. Excuse me, we have the money. We see it. We see what it's being wasted on. And too many Americans for too long have deferred to the idea of demilitarization as a fantasy, as something that we just can't do. And part of why David and I are running for Congress is that answer isn't good enough anymore. And I want to put wheels on this car and turn the screw very sharply. Before the pandemic hit, climate chaos was already wreaking havoc, not just with human populations across the planet, but particularly here in California, where David and I both live. I'm thinking about the catastrophic wildfires that have ravaged our planet, our state, every summer and fall for the last several years, and which will continue to do so indefinitely until we pass a Green New Deal and put a generation of people back into the land and in the forest, particularly to replicate indigenous forest management techniques. That's a labor-intensive project that the market cannot possibly meet the need of, because there's no profit motive for it in anyone, right? These are the kinds of projects that we can mobilize around as a society. We've done things like this before. We need to meet the needs of the future, and we can't defer to yesterday's systems any longer. The only reason that the military-industrial complex has survived this long is because the generation of policymakers that for the last 3 years has turned a deaf ear has refused to turn over the reins, which is why we are running to take them. The last thing I would just say here to connect a couple dots is that the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex is inextricably connected to the climate catastrophe. Not only does the Pentagon recognize climate chaos as our leading national security threat, it has advanced it relentlessly for the last 70 years. Every CIA intervention in the global South, every war for profit that we've initiated has extracted natural resources, including particularly fossil fuels. It's not just destabilizing democracy and undermining human rights that the CIA and the Pentagon have been doing for the last 70 years. We've been ducking into the punch of climate chaos at the same time. And if we mean to achieve climate justice, we need to put the CIA on a leash. And these are all parts of an intersectional equation that forced David and I to both run for Congress, because incumbent Democrats are unfortunately as much a part of each of these problems as the GOP.
And to add to that, I think what Shahid was sharing, he nailed it on the bigger theme of these elected officials obviously not prioritizing the people, but continuing and perpetuating a system where corporate interests are the first and foremost priority to uphold and serve, and the short-term maximization of profits. And so that's what's motivating all of these different acts and examples that Shahid has shared. And so just even with this current pandemic, why is it that 82% of the tax reforms in the CARES Act actually favor those who make over $1 million? Why is it that millionaires they just made $70 billion in tax reform cuts through the CARES Act? And these are the things that our elected officials should be alerted about, to be on notice. But they're just going ahead and passing anything that comes across their desk. And at a time where the people really need help, where at least over 30-40% of people in Los Angeles didn't pay their July rent. This is a very serious issue. And what's sad to see is that we've been programmed to think that we have no money. Where did all of this money come out from? For the $500 billion for businesses, for the $4+ trillion that is set aside for bigger businesses. What's going on? And so I think for us, what we need to realize is, oh, wow, like this is being said, yet this is being done. This is being said, yet this is being done. And just like the common phrase is, actions speak louder than words. What are we seeing right now? And that's a big realization that all of us need to have on a mass level. So what are the next steps? Where do we go from here is the question that we should all be asking ourselves. And so with regards to the Pentagon budget, we can be defunding that and allocating that in different ways. So if we were to happen to defund 30% of the Pentagon budget, what would that look like? And if you look at this graphic that we have here, in regards to how we can allocate and defund the Pentagon budget with resources, we can be spending it on different social security services. We could be spending it on towards food security, towards housing, towards free education, towards school lunch. And so if you look here, we have all of these different ways that we could be rebudgeting and reallocating with still $70 billion left over. And so in a time where the people actually need care, where the people are actually the economy, I know that a lot of people ask, how do we be concerned about the economy while also being concerned about public health? They're not mutually exclusive. The economy is the people, and if we're not helping the people, then you're framing it into a mutually exclusive situation when it's not. And so these are the truths and realities that we need to be waking up to and talking about.
And if I can, just to spell out some of those particular opportunities to invest in social needs, if we can just pull the slide back up, there are a bunch of particular social needs that people across the state of California and across the country are struggling with. One of them is housing, right? Before the pandemic hit, housing was already untenable here in California. Even very highly compensated people in San Francisco have been struggling for years with paying for rental costs in the most expensive rental market at one point on the planet, as far as I understand. And I'm grateful that it's receded somewhat from those peaks, but it's still unbearable for too many people. And frankly, the racial composition of our city has been, frankly, transformed over the last generation due to the gentrification and displacement that the lack of affordable housing has forced on our community. I often wonder how different that history might have been had the Democratic Party not been led by a wealthy commercial landlord. And it is revealing, I think, that each of the major corporate parties are led by wealthy commercial landlords who share class interests. It would suggest that what we pretend is a democracy might resemble, in fact, from a distance perspective, something much more like an oligarchy. And we should grapple and recognize that. It is the context in which we run. And it's the context for this housing crisis that we could help relieve if we defunded the Pentagon. In addition to housing, other crucial social needs include particularly a right to food. There is a crisis around the country, from kids in schools to struggling families, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. And I've spent time volunteering at food banks in the last few months, and I've seen people line up around the block trying to get some help. We could be investing in those kinds of social needs instead of missiles and aircraft carriers. That's where our tax dollars should be spent. And that's where our tax dollars could be spent if we elect new voices to make different choices in the next session of Congress.
I wanted to also make a point of clarification. As Shahid, you were talking about the wealthy landlord that's running the Democratic Party. You're not talking about Trump as in the one that's running the Republican Party right now. You're speaking of Nancy Pelosi.
That's right. Yeah, she's a wealthy commercial landlord with multiple properties. She lives on a vineyard in Napa Valley. There's actually been a couple empty chair debates at a residence that she maintains here in San Francisco for the sake of appearing to live in the district. And of course, she hasn't been home on any of those occasions. And it's been 33 years since she showed up for a debate. But yeah, the class interests of the leadership of the Democratic Party often go overlooked. But I think they're an inextricable part of the equation, and this consistency of corporate rule that unites each of the corporate parties despite the theater of partisan gridlock that they contrive.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, it was my opponent owns several properties. So I think that's not something that's unique to either my opponent or Shahid's opponent. I wouldn't be surprised if every single representative has a couple properties, and because they have that padded life, they're not able to really connect with deep down and experience the needs of the community. They're not grounded in their communities. And that's why they're legislating left here and there all over the place. And that's why they're not able to recognize the housing crisis that we have. Just like what Shahid was sharing, we have 40 million renter households in the nation, and half of them are rent burdened. 20 million plus renter households before COVID-19 were rent burdened. A fourth of those 40 plus million renter households pay over 50% of their income towards rent. What are our representatives doing when most of their income is going towards rent? Then how are people supposed to live? How are they supposed to pay for education, for healthcare, for their basic expenses, to go ahead and get the needs that they have? And so this model, that graphic that Shahid explained in more detail, it's about providing the needs for the people. So for us, when we talk about actions speak louder than words, if the representative is truly representing the will of the people and loving the people, what does that look like? Because we all know that love isn't just a word. It appears like something. Love looks like something in action. So for an elected official, love looks like ensuring and making sure that every person in our country doesn't have to worry about getting food to eat, healthy food to eat, having a roof to sleep under with a room, having access to education, healthcare, and being able to pay their basic expenses. And these are the priorities that our elected officials need to move 180 degrees and really focus on, instead of doing this while they're trying to serve their corporate donors and corporate interests and saying, we'll care about the people, we'll legislate. And then they go back to their people giving crumbs and asking for their feedback. What kind of government and system are we living in? And now's the time for us to really make noise and to stand up. And Shahid and I, we will be participating, and other congressional candidates will be participating in a protest strike this Saturday about demanding a people's stimulus, a stimulus that is needed so much for people all around the country and not just in our state right now. So in regards to the people's stimulus, what those demands are, for those who are curious of what those are. So it is demanding at a time where people, first of all, it's the thing that we touched upon in the beginning, is demilitarizing and defunding the police and diverting those funds to community resources like healthcare, like education, like more public service, and directly benefiting our Black communities because they've been shut out for the system for too long. The second demand is Medicare for all. People didn't have healthcare before, and now millions more are off healthcare because they don't have jobs anymore. And it's absurd that healthcare is tied to a job when it should be single payer healthcare for everyone, where they don't have to be worrying about that. The third demand is monthly $2,000 cash recurring relief to the people that are hurting right now, because again, the people are the economy of our country, and that's who we should be helping out right now. In regards to the fourth,
can I just offer one thing there, David?
Yeah.
And I think we're agreed about this. The basic income program that we propose is universal. So certainly to people who are struggling, but I just want to distinguish between the means tested sort of alternatives that preceded our generation, the failed neoliberal attempts to distinguish between who needs what, and the universal programs that we propose as an alternative, less administrative costs, more wide distribution of benefits, bringing all of us together instead of creating and contriving artificial distinctions and tensions among us. And I certainly favor a universal program, and I know you do too. I just wanted to spell that out.
Yes, thank you so much. And to add one point to that, in a pandemic where it makes sense to suspend, cancel rent and mortgages, we have representatives who are opting and supporting a means-tested method where they're all for their people and their constituents jumping through hoops to apply for a $100 billion rent relief fund that primarily benefits landlords, who can also dip into other housing funds in that HEROES Act. And so when you have these types of representatives legislating for us, it should make us want to cry and to be sad and to really fight for change and electing people who want to help and serve the people. So continuing on with the people's stimulus demands, we have protecting small business with covering payroll, because that's essentially what we need right now, where all of our small businesses are dying out. In LA and in Los Angeles, all of our restaurants are suffering at least 80% drop in sales. Many of them are closing down. What are we doing about that? There's nothing being discussed and implemented in terms of any of that. We need to suspend rent and cancel mortgage and cancel rent. We need to suspend all debt payments to any credit lender right now, because we're in a situation where people need desperate relief and desperate help right now. So with the people's stimulus, we're encouraging for those who are watching to find out if there will be a protest at your congressional representative's residence this Saturday. I know that Shahid will be speaking outside of one of Nancy Pelosi's residence. I'll be speaking outside one of my opponent's residences or properties, as is Angelica Duenas and other congressional candidates across the state and nation. Because now's a time where we can't just be sitting down and twiddling our thumbs, hoping that the same elected officials that we elect will make things change and change it all around, because that's insanity when we continue to do that.
Patricia, are there any questions that we should respond to that might have come in?
Yeah, at this moment, you all can start submitting questions to either the Q&A element on your screen or through the chat window, and we will pose them directly to the candidates. In the meantime, I think one thing we might want to discuss is campaign finance reform and the role that might play within our current system.
One of the places I'd really draw a root here is Buckley versus Vallejo. This is a Supreme Court case from the 1970s that equated money and speech for the purposes of constitutional analysis. One of my very first, in fact, my first case as a young lawyer 20 years ago was Shays versus FEC. I was representing the House co-sponsors of the McCain-Feingold Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2003. This is the last time Congress tried to take corporate money out of politics. And we won that case before the DC Circuit in 2006, vindicating campaign finance reform 4 years before the Supreme Court in the Citizens United decision basically tore down everything that we built in that era of my career. And it basically invited a floodgate of corporate capital into elections. There's multiple points of the problem. I want to sketch these out sort of chronologically as they emerge in the course of a legislator's path. So there's corruption in the process of campaign finance, in the sense of too many candidates chasing very wealthy donors and pandering to their interests to the exclusion of the working class people, the democracy that we aim to represent. And one area where I feel very grateful, our campaign is funded by small donors. Our average contribution is $20. And as a result, I and the generation, David and our generation of policymakers, we're not beholden to wealthy donors in the way that corporate politicians are, because that's not how we run our campaigns. There's a later problem after you in office, and this is in the form of corporate lobbying. So let's say, we each win our races and we're in Congress, it's in our first term. There are any number of organizations, from nonprofit social justice organizations to corporations, any number of their industrial associations, and they'll be in our offices suggesting reforms. And for every one lobbyist that the ACLU will send, the American Chemical Association and the Police Officers Association and the insert corrupt corporate lobby here will send 50. And every single one of them will have not just talking points and suggestions and threats and carrots and screws and all that, but they'll also have legislative text. And most offices in Congress, they do the easy thing. They take the bill that ALEC gives them and they run with it, because it was already written. They've done the hard work. And in the hard work, they baked in the corporate interest that they want to enshrine into the law. That's how we got here, because 2 generations of Democrats have played along with that game. That's not what David or I are going to do. We are going there to legislate on behalf of the people of the United States, not to take our marching orders from corporate donors. So whether it's campaign finance to get into office or the influence of capital, particularly corporate influence in the lobbying process. There's another problem later in the process where, let's say, someone is no longer serving in a legislature. Either they've retired or maybe they've lost an election. In more or less every case, the career track is to then go work on K Street for some corporate lobbying firm. Incidentally, Nancy Pelosi just bailed out a bunch of them using taxpayer money in one of these coronavirus stimulus measures, which is, basically like giving money to your former employees and future employers. And this this revolving door between Congress and K Street is corruption, plain and simple, not just, again, in the election context and in the policymaking context, but also the post-service context, where policymakers go on to then represent various special interests. At every stage in that process, we see the unacceptable democracy eroding influence of corporate capital. And another way I would put that is that capitalism is killing democracy. The two values could not be in more direct tension. We pretend that they're aligned because of a historical circumstance in the sort of, history of monarchies devolving, but capitalism and democracy absolutely pull in opposite directions. Capitalism promotes inequality. Democracy relies on equality. And so there's, beyond that conceptual difference, we see the role of capital in our elections very perniciously here. And I'm eager, after we win, maybe the last thing I'd say here is, in the challenge that both David and I are presenting against established corporate incumbents, our races also encapsulate the repudiation of corporate capital. I was outspent by the incumbent 15-1 in the primary. She is the most prolific corporate fundraiser on the planet. And she defends those corporate interests, which are kicking everyone's grandchildren off a cliff. And I'm not willing to have it. And the 25,000 donors around the country who flock to our campaign aren't willing to have it. And the future can't take it anymore. And as we talk about the need to challenge these entrenched incumbents, our races aim not only to put us in a position to legislate restrictions on the role of money in politics, but our races could themselves be very loud signals sending the message that money alone is not enough, that you can't just buy an election anymore in the United States the way too many corporate Democrats have in the past.
Yeah, to share just a little more on that, and Shahid has beautifully done so. You think, why don't we have Medicare for all right now? Legit question, totally legit question. Why? Because Shahid's opponent, my opponent, other representatives are taking big farm money from pharmaceutical companies, from healthcare companies, making calls. Shahid's opponent made calls to the healthcare industry executive saying, you know what, we're not going to pass Medicare for all. You're okay. Like, don't be too worried. When we have these conflict of interest, how are you going to say that you're ruling and representing the people? How are you going to put out an ad like my opponent does and say, I'm for free public college and education, but yet take money from student debt collectors? What's going on? And these are the things that we need to see that's very glaring in our face. And their prioritization of corporate interests for the past 30, 40 years has got to stop. Why is it that we, as a people, 70% of our Americans are living paycheck to paycheck? Why is it that most of us don't have savings? If you go back 1978, how did the pension die? Because corporate lobbyists asked Congress to pass on the risk and burden of pensions and savings to the people themselves because they didn't want to deal with it. And so we have the death of the pension in 1978. And throughout all of those years, even just recently with the CARES Act, I don't have to repeat anything I just said, with these representatives bailing out their same corporate donors. So what can we do to wash it out? Just like Shahid, my opponent has a war chest of, I haven't even calculated the numbers, but probably 15, 20 times at least as well. How do we do that? We need to, of course, obviously the first thing is to overturn Citizens versus United in any way that we can, but it's also coming up with different policy measures that we can put in place. So one of the things that we're championing is democracy dollars. What would it look like if we were to give every single person $100 to be spending and allocating towards a certain candidate or a certain candidate's campaign? What would that do? That would wash up lobbyist money 8-1, and we wouldn't even have to worry about, we would actually be able to focus on the issues that matter, on connecting with people, on talking about our platform, on talking about the visions that we have and how we can go about doing this instead of spending a lot of our time fundraising. It doesn't, like, I know that Shahid would totally agree. We don't want to be spending our time fundraising, but we have to. And so in order to change that, in order to make it more democratic, we need to get rid of corporate financing of elections and campaigns. And that's the first and foremost thing, because otherwise this will continue and perpetuate. So that I know is a top priority on Shahid's platform, as well as it is a top priority on my platform as well.
Thank you. And we do now have a question. It's coming from Lawrence Abbott. And I wanted to say one more time, if people want to ask questions, if you could please submit your name, where you're coming from, either your location, or if you're a member of the media, your media outlet, as well as what your question is. This question comes from Lawrence Abbott, who is participating via social media, I believe. His question is, will you both sign the candidate's pledge to end corporate personhood and money as speech?
Certainly money is speech and corporate personhood. There are different issues, and it's careful. I want to take care to distinguish them because people conflate them. Buckley versus Vallejo was the Supreme Court that established money as speech. Citizens United was the latest of several cases addressing corporate personhood. Now, corporate personhood is a principle that is bigger than money in politics. Corporate personhood is the thing that lets the ACLU sue the NSA to keep them out of your email account, right? So we tinker with corporate personhood at great risk. And I just want to make clear that the effort to address it needs to be thoughtful about preserving opportunities for voluntary associations to vindicate shared community interests, right? And I'm thinking particularly about the Earth Justice Legal Defense Fund or the Lakota Law Project. I want to make sure that they can still get in court. That is the critical thing that that ending corporate personhood could risk. Now, breaking the link between money and speech is critical. I want to make this sharper, though, or like take it a step further. It's not enough for us as members of Congress to say it, because nothing we can do can address that. That's what the Supreme Court intervening means. It's off the table for the policymaking bodies. That's one reason why my proposal to end judicial life tenure to restore judicial independence is so important. A lot of people have become aware in the wake of Brett Kavanaugh's nomination and confirmation to the Supreme Court that what passes for law in this country is a racket. And I'm proud to have fought Brett Kavanaugh's nomination in 2006 to the DC Circuit, 10 years before most Americans ever heard his name. He was a torture lawyer in the Bush administration who literally can't travel to other countries without fear of being rightfully and legally detained as an international criminal. And he sits on the US Supreme Court for life. And that's what I want to end. There's no reason that criminals should have lifetime appointments. There's no reason anyone should have a lifetime appointment. An 18-year term for a judge is plenty of time to gain expertise, to influence the law. It's enough time that they're insulated from political pressures in the meantime, and it allows the future to set its own course without being dictated to by people acculturated to stale consensuses from 50 years ago. Kavanaugh is poised, like Alito, like Gorsuch, to sit on the court and lord over the rest of us, unelected, appointed judges for the better part of 2 generations if we don't move them off the bench. And some people have suggested packing the court by adding new seats. I think that's problematic because it replaces one set of pro-corporate biases for a different set of biases. And I don't want to replace a biased court with another biased court. I want to liberate the court from political interference. That's the vision of the constitutional design. And the only way we do that is by ensuring turnover on the court. And that's what 18-year staggered terms can do. So if we're serious about ending the corporate role of the corporate role of finance in elections, we have to get serious about recovering the Supreme Court as a neutral institution and get its knee off the neck of our democracy.
David,
Yes.
did you have anything to add?
Yes, just to add to that, I mean, Shahid explained it very well, the corporate personhood and the necessity of holding these corporate entities responsible for the acts that they're doing, just like what we have here in SoCal with the PG&E in regards to all of the blatant, unconscionable acts that they're doing. They need to be held accountable. So yes, I agree and completely support with what Shahid just shared as well in regards to the judicial system as well.
Great. Our next question comes from Nate, who is also watching on social media. He wants to know, how do you intend to stay current with constituents from your seat in Congress?
Yeah, I think what has caused us to come to this place is the people, that's us, those watching, me, Shahid, we're not holding our elected officials accountable. But besides that, they're not even having dialogue or conversation with us. To be a representative, I mean, I'm not going to do it elementary, but represent. What does represent mean? It's very basic. To represent, like to convey and communicate the will, the needs, and the concerns of your people, your community that you're in. So why is it that we have elected representatives like my opponent who have town halls towards campaign season time, where even with these town halls, they make it very difficult for you to attend. They announce it the day of their town hall on their Facebook. And then when you go to their Facebook, then you have to go to their government website. And then when you go to their government website, they tell you to sign up to receive email updates on when that town hall is. And then you do it. And then you have 2 hours left until the town hall starts and you haven't received an email. So this town hall is happening without you. And then it happens again. Even though you've signed up for that email to receive notifications about a town hall, you get the same notification of go to our website and sign up. So how in the world are people supposed to converse and co-govern with their representatives? And representatives should be co-governing with their people and their communities that they're in. They shouldn't be legislating in DC first in closed rooms and then coming back and asking the people what their thoughts are on legislation that's already been passed or legislation that's already been co-sponsored and supported. And so we need to flip it all around where we have representatives who are being held accountable, who hold weekly office hours or regular office hours with constituents in their community and are able to dialogue and have an open forum, whether that be online or offline or whichever works best. And that's how a representative government works. And that's what it should be and should look like.
Absolutely.
So
go ahead, David. Please, after you.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add. So that's why for our campaign, like even right now, if you want to sign up for an office hour, go to our website, davidkim2020.com, CD34 constituent hours. And this is something that we will continue to have even after being elected, holding these office hours for our constituents. Sorry, Shahid, go ahead.
No, not at all. No need to apologize. Great thoughts all around and fully on the same page. Couple of thoughts here. Nancy Pelosi is a very rare face in San Francisco. The last town hall that she hosted, to my knowledge, was a year ago. It was hosted in the middle of the afternoon on the west side of town in a relatively inaccessible part of town, nowhere near any transit stops, at a middle school that her staff controlled access to and affirmatively blocked anyone at least wearing any campaign buttons related to our campaign from coming in. And it was interesting. You know, there were teachers and community members. I spoke to someone whose partner is a teacher in the school who was harassed trying to go to the school, to the town hall that our elected representative was hosting. And, you know, to see that entitlement in hosting a town hall once a year in a completely inconvenient place at an inconvenient time and then limiting who can come, it's basically a campaign rally, right? And as David's talking about what representation entails, the first part of representation is simply to listen and hear what the community needs. And part of what we're running for is because we've done that. And we've discovered that the voting records of the incumbents diverged so dramatically from our communities. You know, we've talked about the crisis in affordable housing. We've talked about the crisis in policing. We've talked about the crisis in our military industrial complex. In all these areas, our incumbents have abandoned our communities entirely. And we are running to recover that representation. You know, it's because we are constituents and we are current with the community that we are aiming to effectuate the vindication of our interests. Another thought I just note here is what we are running to put in front. You know, too many members of Congress, as David was noting before, are themselves very wealthy individuals who put the accumulation of capital themselves at the front of their own personal agendas. You know, and I'm noting here, without drawing aspersions, I'll just note as a matter of fact that Nancy Pelosi's husband owns a business that got a $1 million Paycheck Protection Program loan. And this is a program that hasn't reached all small business owners. I have a supporter who owns a small business on the East Coast who noted that her business got $1,000 from this program that Pelosi's husband got $1 million for. And, you know, when policymakers are passing programs that then benefit businesses co-owned by their spouses, we have a word for that. It starts with C and it ends in eruption. And we should recognize when it's implicated. And that's part of what happens when we have policymakers who are disconnected from their communities. It's because they're too connected to their wallets. You know, I'm thinking about Senator Burr, for instance, right? And the GOP senators who have been recently found to have participated in insider trading. There was a provision passed by the House called the Pelosi provision to legalize what was previously illegal insider trading by policymakers. I'm not going to Congress to fill my wallet. I don't own anything. I don't own a house. I don't own a car. I own a bicycle and I'm happy with it because I'm not looking for money. It's not what I'm here for. I care about your rights. I care about our democracy. My parents brought me here because opportunity and liberty are timeless values. I am running for office because I care too deeply about our republic to watch it get railroaded by careerists. And as we think about how to stay connected to our constituents, I think a critical part of that recipe is to put our constituents first, instead of the maximization and the accumulation of our own capital. And that seems to be the mission that unites too many members of Congress at the moment, both Republicans and, unfortunately, too many Democrats.
Great. The next question, again, it comes from social media, and I want to give another announcement that if people can include their name, location, or media outlet, and also your gender pronoun as well, so we can make sure we identify that correctly.
Thank you, Patricia, for noting
that. So the next question is, since you're both going up against well-known incumbents, how are you working on getting the name recognition that you need within your district?
I'm happy to answer that or defer to you, David, either one. I mean, for our campaign, it's been a combination of strategies. One piece of it very much is the ground game. So over the course of the campaign, we're in our third year to liberate this seat. And and our volunteers have been very frequent participants in social movements, from actions to defund police, to stop PG&E from being bailed out, to clamor for climate justice, to seeking universal health care. On all of these different issues, we've been very visible in public. We're also very visible on the doors. Until the pandemic hit, we had a very active program reaching voters at their residences and at community centers, particularly farmers markets in their respective neighborhoods. In the wake of the pandemic, we've shifted that voter outreach program particularly to the phone. So we're making thousands of phone calls a week with hundreds of volunteers and dozens of paid callers. In addition to that voter outreach program, we're also very active online. Our social media audiences continue to grow. I'm frankly humbled and astounded every day at the just sheer volume of people that are flocking to our campaign from across the city and even further beyond it. And then traditional media sources also are another opportunity for us to get out the word, and particularly not just build name recognition, but also deconstruct the official and corporate media narratives that have contrived false impressions of the incumbents as supposedly standing with their constituents. You know, the corporate media constructs this tension between Democrats and Republicans, obscuring how much Democrats do to advance conservative interests. So the traditional media exposure and opportunities that our campaign has enjoyed for me are as much about challenging and reframing that narrative as they are about building the name recognition for the alternative that we present the voters of San Francisco. Just yesterday, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have been interviewed by Jeremy Scahill from The Intercept. That might have been one of the most prolific appearances that our campaign has had. The Intercept released that podcast just yesterday, and I look forward to more opportunities to continue educating the public about the overlooked facts that corporate media have been too reluctant to share.
Yeah, thank you for sharing on your race in particular, Shahid. And it seems like we do have some overlapping similarities. Pre-COVID-19, we were on the ground meeting with different community members, going out and from door to door and taking as many meetings as possible. After COVID-19 hit, obviously we had to adjust to the digital landscape, but it's not to say that our relief efforts and communicating efforts didn't end there, because we started, I know that for a lot of us in Los Angeles, many people weren't able to pay rent and haven't paid rent and now aren't able to pay rent, whether it be whichever stage that is. And so in regards to text banking and showing them where they can go ahead and receive relief, or how they can handle the situation that they're in, or focusing a spotlight on local mom and pop and small family business owned restaurants that are struggling, and shining a spotlight on them, going out and participating in food distribution relief efforts that Shahid's campaign has been doing as well. But then also particularly meeting with each community that's been neglected completely without any representation. And so just to give you an example, with us in our district, we have a big Latino population, but they are being taxed without representation right now. What do you call that? That's tyranny. We have so many of them not having the rights, not being able to receive any relief during this pandemic. What are we doing for them? And so it's important for us to be meeting with members and leaders of each community. And that's why we have meetings with the Latinx community. And we are, you'll soon see a Latinx platform page that we will be putting out, that we have co-governed and communicated and talked about with members of that community. We will be putting out a Koreatown platform page. We will be putting out an Iranian platform page, because each of these communities are so important and we can't shut any of them out. And just like what Shahid was saying, ground game is very important, and we're not going to I think it's a matter of us being very strategic. Yes, working and getting as much exposure online and in media is very important, but for candidates like myself, and I'm glad that Shahid had that great media exposure, but for candidates like ourselves in general, the media is not going to put a spotlight on us or tell our story or share our story. And so we are the ones that have to be actively pushing it and promoting it. And so for those who are watching, if you can do all that you can online, that really helps. And so whether it be with fundraising or support or volunteering or getting people that you know that live in Shahid's district or my district to help volunteer and support, that's how we can go ahead and further this movement and expand it more. But at the end of the day, ground game, the ground wars are greater than the air wars. And so we are very tied down to the data, to the numbers on how much we have to win. For our race, last primary election, our incumbent won a total 52%. His challengers and I won a collective percentage of 48%. And so having now received the endorsement and support of my other three challengers, we just need to continue to communicate, to dialogue with those supporters and voters who voted for them, while also increasing the voter base for our district and letting them know, hey, this guy that you thought was legislating and representing you, he's not. And this is how. And so I think it's that educational aspect and that awareness aspect, and also that realization and light bulb aha moment in each of us individually and collectively to say, oh, I matter. Oh, my vote does count. Oh, I should be voting consciously. Yes, we need change. Why is it that in some parts of our district the per capita income is $12,000 and the average rent for one bedroom apartment is $2,000? Why is that? And so these are the ways that we can continue to wake up. And that's a very great question. And I know Shahid's campaign and my campaign are working actively to promote that and to really win this race, because we aren't here for why would we be here to go through all of this, all of these hurdles and time and like not being able to sleep on it? Why would we go through this other than if it's not for the people, and because there's no other time more urgent than now where we really need to step up. And so that's why we're doing this.
I just want to riff on one piece that you said there about people discovering how each of our voices matter. And a big part of the name recognition that we're each building is each of you, our supporters, or frankly, how each of us got here, and the amplification online and at the dinner table, on the phones with your friends, at the, whatever your forums are, whatever your community looks like, that word among the support base is a critical part of the equation. So I just want to invite everyone to step into the realization of how much each of your voices matter. And to the extent that we can be sails in which to blow wind to push forward the ship of social justice, we're each very eager to serve that role.
That's right. And I'd also like to add, having a background in media, your voice matters to the media as well. Few people know that you can contact the San Francisco Chronicle or the LA Times and write a letter to the editor about the issues that you see, or the people you want to vote for. So you can contact the media and also help promote the cause in that way too. Okay, great. Yeah, the next question comes from Jessica from Sacramento, and she asks, what are your thoughts on electoral reform and the ability to actually pass these things that you're talking about?
Happy to address this too, though, David. I don't want to keep jumping in.
Go ahead.
So the electoral reforms, and they include everything from ranked choice voting, proportional representation. David was talking about democracy dollars and the idea of public financing of elections. All of these are mechanisms to try to liberate the voting process and relieve what are basically illegitimate points of co-optation in the process. There's a political scientist from the 1950s, Maurice Duverger, who documented the tendency of first past the post election systems like ours. That's to say a system that gives all points for first place. There's a structural tendency to then reify two parties. And that centralization of two parties is frankly the constraint from which we need to be liberated. It is the thing that has trapped our democracy. And I could maybe just to take 30 seconds on this, the essence of the constitutional design is to divide power. That's why we have a judicial, a legislative, and executive branch, and then a federal and a state and a local system. Think of it as a 9-branch grid, right? And the genius of the constitutional design is to basically set that up almost like crabs in a bucket. So no one of those points in the grid would grow so powerful that it would oppress the rest of us. Now that kind of broke. We think about the role of the presidency at the moment and how much power it has, how effective our aspiring tyrant has been at degrading our rights, because his office has been so relentlessly empowered with the participation of corporate Democrats leading Congress, rendering it structurally unable to conduct its oversight authorities. That's like a whole other layer that we're not talking about now. I want to get back to where the question is, though. The electoral alternatives to enable a more fluid process include the jungle primary structure that California has already adopted. David and I stand here as beneficiaries of an established electoral reform that aims to diminish the unfortunate impacts of the first past the post electoral system. So in most of the country, people think about congressional primaries as closed primaries in which each separate political party has a self-contained election, the winners of which then run against each other in the general election. That's sort of how like the presidential election works, for instance. But in California, recognizing that so much of our state is effectively a one-party region, at least, our state legislature many years ago adjusted the process. So when David and I ran in March, we ran against all of the other challengers in our respective areas. And the jungle primary said that whoever takes first and second place, whatever their parties are going to be the ones in the election. And the incumbents in each of our races took first, and he and I both took second. And so without that nod, without that electoral process reform that California has already adopted, our districts wouldn't have the choice to have new voices in November. Each of the incumbents would be running against Republicans. But instead, they have to run against Democrats because California has already made a choice to advance an electoral reform that creates new opportunities for democracy. Other opportunities like that include proportional representation. This is a system, another kind of approach to counting votes that would structurally enable the emergence of third and minor parties. At the moment, because again, we give only points for first place in each discrete legislative district, the third and minor parties like the Green Party, like the Libertarian Party, like the Working Families Party, don't have opportunities to establish footholds in the national legislature. If in contrast, a state were to say, okay, let's say California, it's a different example. Well, as long as I said it, let's just say, so there's 50 about congressional seats in California. And if, instead of carving the state into 50 discrete chunks, if the race in California were a race in the top 50 vote getters represented the state as a whole, you'd end up seeing representatives from the Green Party and the Libertarian Party winning seats in that slate because it wouldn't just be for first place, right? There are lots of these opportunities. Congress has frankly grappled with none of them. Most election law is a creation of state legislatures. So that's really where the bulk of the action is at. At the federal level, the real story in voting rights has been the Supreme Court striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act about 5 years ago, which unleashed a wave of restrictions on voting rights by right-wing state legislatures. So the action in Congress, I would take this back to where we were just talking about ending judicial life tenure to restore judicial independence, to allow then federal protection for voting rights from right-wing state legislatures that are ultimately, the state legislatures are going to have to be the source for experimentation in these alternative voting methods. I would like to see them proliferate and expand across the country in order to advance democracy and particularly to crack the inclination towards stasis that our current system institutionally entrenches.
Yeah, Shahid answered that very complete, and I don't have anything else to add to that other than if you're in a state where you don't have a jungle primary, which is most likely the case, that's where you can start with your state legislature and really start that electoral reform process in where you're living right now. Because imagine if every state had something where we had in California. Wow, that in and of itself would be huge. We wouldn't see what happened in the races from this week or the races from 2 weeks ago. And so that's definitely a key thing in addition to ranked choice and all of the other things that Shahid and I had shared about.
Great. Okay, so we are nearing the end of our question and answer portion now. And I want to ask you both to just maybe give a few closing remarks and anything else that you want to add for what people should do after this. What kind of call to action is there?
Yeah, for those who are watching, what can I do to be involved? I mean, the obvious and the apparent is to go ahead and help a campaign and movement that's aligned with your heart and values, because that's the first and foremost thing. Like, what gets you fired up? What gets you so passionate? What makes you cry? What makes you happy? And I think it's to find that, and whether it be Shahid's campaign, my campaign, or Eva, or all the other great candidates out there, align with that. And if it's not a campaign and you don't want to, that's not your thing, then go ahead, host a podcast, do other things that you can get involved with. Intangibly speaking, this Saturday, just as we had mentioned earlier, we have a July 11 people's stimulus protest that is being done. And right now, people need help. They're crying for help. They're bleeding for help. And go ahead and check Shahid's Twitter or my Twitter if you live in either in NorCal or SoCal. Go ahead and participate. Or if you're not, then I believe there's a link on, and I'll go ahead and retweet it after this. There's a link where you can sign up to see where's the nearest congressional representative protest action nearest you, and you can participate in those ways.
For not the first time, and I suspect not the last, David Kim has spoken my mind, and I appreciate that. Particularly the reference beyond our races. Electoral activism and opportunities are one part of the puzzle. I want to really just raise up all the other ways that people are advancing social change. So for our races, of course, please sign up to volunteer. We'd love to have you. If you're able to donate to David or I, we'd love your support. Do more, though. You can't pretend that voting's enough. Think global, but act local. Whatever you're concerned, whether it's the racial justice issues that we've been talking about, or climate justice, whether it's universal health care, or getting this criminal president out of office, find some people near you and do anything together. Anything. Start a podcast, stand on a street corner with a sign, do a bake sale and fund some nonprofit, chip in and do like a collective phone banking exercise with one of our campaigns. The list of ways to make a difference is literally limitless. And the key invitation I think we're each offering everyone is to invest your creativity, whatever your passion is, find a way to advance justice using it. And there are a million opportunities for that. That's one of the things here in the Bay that I was so inspired by 20 years ago as a young organizer in the anti-war movement, was seeing the ways in which the participants in it were bringing to bear all of our various capacities. I was a spoken word artist who started organizing performance collectives of artists to reclaim public space and challenge the narrative underlying militarism. I've seen people, yogis for peace, who the Oakland Police Department was shooting at when we shut down the Oakland ports in 2003. I've seen people use every number of passions and interests as organizing vehicles to promote a brighter, more humane future. And I'm grateful to all the work David is doing and all his supporters to advance his campaign in Los Angeles, and all the folks here in San Francisco and around the country advancing our campaign. And I particularly just want to double shout out, draw a circle around, pump my fist in the air for and thank and praise all of the young people who have been transforming our national body politic. This is a youth-led social movement that we are living through. I see the leaders of youth, the leadership of youth, not as leaders of tomorrow, but very much leaders of today. And I'm so grateful for their leadership. And I think David too, we're very eager to represent that voice in our national legislature.
Thank you so much, Shahid. Just one thing to add to that, Patricia, is just to give you a concrete example. Here in Los Angeles, a group of passionate young people were completely upset with the corruption that's going on in our city. So they formed the People's City Council of Los Angeles. They started a GoFundMe. They raised millions of dollars. A handful of young people who care about Los Angeles, less than 10 people, they raised millions of dollars. They helped to go ahead. Black Lives Matter, Los Angeles was leading the movement, but they helped to make Mayor Garcetti defund LAPD by $150 million. Although we need to do more, that's what you can do. So don't think less of yourself or trivialize yourself at all, because change starts with you if you take that first move. So thank you for sharing that, Shahid.
Right on, brother. I can't wait to serve with you in Congress.
Me too. Totally.
Okay. Thank you so much for everyone that's attended.